I lived with the Royal Air Force all my life. My father was a high-ranking officer in the Royal Air Force, and therefore I'd lived for many years on RAF stations. And as a small child, I used to try and get rides on airplanes whenever I could, the transport airplanes. And I was always hanging around the hangars and the maintenance during my school holidays. And there came a time when I got into the film business and the television business as a floor manager, and I earned enough money to get myself a flying license, a private pilot's license. But I had to work as an air traffic controller in order to pay for it. So, by chance, one of the people that was subsequently going to work on the Battle of Britain suggested it would be an ideal situation for me, with all of these three together, to control the aerial sequences from the air as an assistant director in the air. Well, of course, it's boys' own stuff. It's, I mean, the stuff of dreams. Suddenly I was controlling them. It was fantastic. It was a wonderful opportunity.
After I finished this series called The Secret Agent and The Prisoner, I was asked to take over the second unit of Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. So that's when I met a lot of aerial cameramen, Skeets Kelly, Johnny Jordan, both who were the key guys on Battle of Britain. And so we shot all the balloon sequences over the cliffs of Dover, over to Germany and the Mad King's Castle. And that was for Cubby Broccoli. And I guess because him and Harry Saltzman were partners with the Bond movies, that is probably how I got recommended. Get this kid, he knows about flying.
It was not mainstream at all. We were a very small unit, the aerial sequence unit, of about a dozen people who operated the Mitchell B-25. We had 3 units in the film. We had the main principal unit, which did the story.
That should damn well never.
We had a second unit, which did a lot of the second unit flying, a lot of taxiing, taking off, landing. They also were up in the air too, but in the bombers, in the actual aircraft themselves. And the flying unit, which was based inside the Mitchell B-25, which was a perfect vehicle for filming from, because as a bomber during the war, it had a boom tail. The tail fins are on a boom, so that the camera, which was a gun, of course, in the old days, can get a good swing at the back. It also had a mid-upper turret, which we converted into the control room, where I sat. And it had front windows where the bomb aimer used to sit, which we converted with a optically perfect hemispheric bowl, which we shot the front shots out of.
Psychedelic monster, which had the camera in it. And they had it painted in such bright colours that none of the aircraft flying towards it would hit it. And they called it the psychedelic monster.
The pilot and owner of the aircraft, Jeff Hawke, decided that it should be as visible as possible in the sky, because he envisaged very close proximity shots, lots and lots of shots of the aircraft immediately behind us, or just to the left of us, or just to the right of us. And that required individual one-on-one, rather than these big formations we've talked about. Someone's down and we go with him. It was important that he could find us again, to do it again. It's very difficult when you're all pulling around and heaving each other. You just see an airplane, a dot up there. Which way is it going? What's it doing? Is it descending? Is it climbing? So it was multicoloured for that purpose.
First problems we had is that when you're shooting in Panavision, which is widescreen that this movie was shot in, to give it scale, because it was a huge, epic movie, the planes, once we got them in formation, were like little dots. You couldn't even recognize, is that a Messerschmitt? Is that a Spitfire? So the cameramen were always saying, closer, closer. Now, you've got a B-25 flying at 200 miles an hour that way, and these planes are coming towards you at 200 miles an hour. And there's turbulence, and there's clouds. It has to be so precise, because tragedy could happen any hour. I mean, we were always terrified of a huge collision up there.
Bernie Williams was the production manager of the aerial sequences and the second unit. So as a production manager, he was responsible for getting it all together. I mean, the mere fact that there was fuel at the airplane on time was ordered by him. The mere fact everybody was paid by him, employed by him. It was a normal unit run as a production manager will, with a schedule, looking at the budget, running it within his budgetary requirements, working very closely with the Tubby Simpson, who was the chief maintenance officer. Because at any one time you could have 6 or 7 units with God knows how many cameras we had. We had we had 4 or 5 Panavision cameras alone, all the latest Panavision gear, as well as a normal 35mm. He had a large crew there, and he was keeping us there. We lived on the airfield, and we were fed on the airfield. We slept at the airfield. So as a production manager, he was running all of that in total administration. It was, I mean, a tremendous experience for him, tremendous, because he was running an air force.
Now, as fighter controllers, you'll be joining an organization which, thank the good Lord, was not rushed up hastily yesterday. It'll be a pain in the neck to the enemy when he comes. It's the Joker up our sleeves.
They shunted me down to Tablada airfield near Seville in Spain to take over to do the aerial shots, they said, the aerial shots. So I arrived in Tablada to see 1 Spitfire, 1 helicopter, 4 camera crew, an assistant director, and about 50 Heinkels and 60 Messerschmitts laying on the airfield. That was the aerial unit at that time. So it was a little confusing to me because I thought, well, how are we going to shoot all the aerial sequences with this small group of people? But it was the teething process for us all to discover that there was a monster out there, and we were going to have to face it at some point. The emphasis seemed to be on the ground with all the actors, and that was where the big unit was. And here I am with this little mini unit, and I think that was like the thinking at the time was, yeah, they'll do a few shots of airplanes flying about, and then we'll figure it all out later. And as I say, it started off with 8 people and became a crew of 740 by the time we got into the serious battle scenes. I started in Spain for 5 weeks. I was told I'd be in Spain. Okay. And I started in March of '68. I think they fired me in October of '68. I mean, that's 6 weeks turned into 6 months. That's why the film went over budget. David Bracknell was the second unit director. He'd worked with Guy Hamilton as an assistant director, and he was given this huge break by Guy Hamilton. So he understood how Guy worked and how Guy thought and what Guy wanted. So David would be at the briefings every day, and each day we would agree what we were going to do that day in terms of which planes could fly, flying hours, how many pilots had rested, and so on. What were the weather conditions? How big was the airspace available that particular day, because it would change constantly.
We could have been thrown out of a range where we were filming if we didn't do it properly, if we didn't stay in the right areas, if we drifted into controlled airspace or anything like that. You always needed the air traffic controller up there to get them home, because once these pilots were concentrating so heavily on what they were doing, navigation went out of the window. And we took it to extremes where you always needed to know how to get back, because you had to zigzag through full military operational aircraft stations. I mean, the sort of 4-minute warning stations.
One day, for example, we were filming at Duxford, and we eventually got all our planes up in the air, and they were flying around in complete formation. And a squadron of Vulcan bombers came straight up through the sky and through our formation. They didn't know we were there, and we didn't know they were there. I mean, that's terrifying. That was a day of rest for everybody and a change of underwear. The responsibility of going up is huge. There were lives up there at stake. There were lives at stake of the people photographing them. And if a plane fell out of the sky and landed in someone's house or a street or a town, that would have been catastrophic for this movie.
The aerial photography on the picture, I'm sure, was dangerous. I mean, it was dangerous shooting from the ground because they would come very low. I was nearly killed on 2 occasions on it. I think risks were taken then were far greater than will probably be allowed now. But when you did have a Spitfire or an M109 coming in at you at a great speed and clearing your head just by about 3 or 4 feet, and it was about 10 feet off the ground, it was very scary, actually. A lot of it was scary.
And that's why we had to be very meticulous about every scene we did. Nothing was done, from the hip, ever. We actually used to sit on the ground every day with David Bracknell, who was the second unit director, Commandante Santa Cruz, who was in charge of all the Spanish pilots. Then they would get out all the little aeroplanes. They would get out storyboards, because we had to have storyboards because it gets too confusing.
And we rehearsed it, much to their chagrin and much to our embarrassment, we rehearsed it with everybody taking a position on the hangar floor. And you are blue 3, you are blue 4, right, action. And we all shuffled across like that, and the other shuffled across like that. And they were indignant about doing this, of course, these pilots, because they can do it in their sleep. But we had to know whether it would work or not. We used to be dispatched up in the air with storyboards. This is what I want it to look like. Well, these are comic cuts. I mean, you've got a shot of a Messerschmitt here and a Spitfire bearing down on it, and it's there forever, isn't it? But in reality, it's boom, and it's gone. It's 4 frames. And so we've got to try and work out how best to do that. And the terribly sad thing about the aerial sequence of the Battle of Britain is we just about worked out how to do it when it was time to stop. It took us the length of the film to work out how to get it right. We had a terrible problem with authenticity. The camouflage was so good, and the aircraft was so authentic that we couldn't see them in the air. Because obviously camouflage is designed to hide the aircraft from the enemy, and we couldn't find it either, where most of this took place. There was a lot more white cloud, and we actually looked for white cloud to get the lighting right.
The Spanish Air Force were using Heinkels, which were, again, old. I think we were all surprised that the Spanish Air Force were using them, but they were using them for training pilots. So the Spanish Air Force were able, through Hamish Mahdi, who was the collector of all these airplanes, who was a courageous, highly decorated bomber in World War II, his job was to get this Air Force, the Harry Saltzman Air Force. So all the big formation sequences of the Heinkels and Messerschmitts were shot in Spain with one Spitfire. We were shooting parts of the dogfight in the Battle of Britain in Spain with one Spitfire and 50 Heinkels and 60 Messerschmitts. And then we would go to England to do all the Spitfire and Hurricane sequences with 2 Heinkels and 60 Messerschmitts. It's a crazy jigsaw puzzle, but somehow it worked. And that was because we had to be meticulous with storyboarding and all these models and have an exact plan. I had to fly the 2 Heinkels and the 17 Messerschmitts back from Tablada, Spain, right up through Spain, across France, across the English Channel, into Duxford, which is probably 60, 70 miles north of London. But we have all these planes covered in German swastikas. You know, that's not a good thing. People didn't like to see those aeroplanes flying about, even in 1968. We had to get special permissions to fly over France with the markings still on the aircraft.
You are always restricted to the lowest common denominator. So different aircraft have different amounts of fuel, and some aircraft are more efficient at burning that fuel than others. Also, if they
would have to take off one at a time. So it would take 45 minutes to get 20 planes up in the air and get them into formation. That took an hour just to get them all in a group. Then we would have to fly for like 25 minutes with our camera helicopter or B-25 camera plane to get them in the position for action. So now we've lost an hour and a half, and now the pilots are saying, I've only got about half an hour's fuel left. So we would then have to shoot that particular time. That could be done under perfect weather conditions. We would never go up unless there was a hole in the clouds, so we could get back down in emergencies. And there were emergencies. And so I remember Harry Saltzman calling me and saying, we've got to shut down this flying unit. It's costing a fortune. We're over budget. We have to finish. And you're shut down every day at Duxford with this bad weather. What are we going to do? I said, let's fly to where the sun is. Where's that? I said, France. So, okay. So we flew to the south of France. We were chasing the sun all through that summer. And we couldn't shoot downwards in France because all the earth was bright red, which didn't match the Kent farmland. So we did all the shooting up scenes in France, and then we came back and did all the shooting down scenes for Kent. So between 3 countries, that was the Battle of Britain. 3 different countries, 3 different skies, and yet it all worked. It's called movie magic.
The weather was so bad in England, we went to France, and I had to take a convoy down, of aircraft down. And our first stop was supposed to be Dinant, and the weather closed in, so we diverted to Le Touquet. And even then the weather was closing in, and we needed radar. Well, of course, they haven't even got the Le Touquet frequency. So what we had to do was leave them above the cloud, circling, pick on 3, get one behind the tail and one on each wing. I'm listening to the radar controller in my earpiece and talking to them on their frequency. So I've got this ear listening to air traffic, and this ear listening to them, which is a terrible thing to do, I have to say, whilst they talked us down. And they followed the Mitchell B-25. And as long as they formated with him through the cloud, we were doing radar-controlled approaches, we pulled up 100 feet above the runway and pulled around and went off again and left them to land. Me still clearing them to land as we're going up to pick up the next 3 and bring them down. Well, we did that 4 times. So we did 4 radar-controlled descents, one after another, pulling each of these guys in. And when the last one got down, as he went to the landing position you've already spoken and dropped his tail, the fuel ran out. He had that little left. That was hairy.
The sad thing for the movie was the weather. I think the weather killed us, because it would have been a much more less expensive movie. It would have been far more enjoyable to shoot, because we lost so much time waiting around for weather.
Had a very strange end. We slowly thinned out till in the end it was 1 helicopter and 1 shot left. And I think it was Canfield in the script bailing out. We had this trick with the camera in the helicopter here. The 2-seater comes along. We've got a dummy in the back seat, and the back cockpit's open. And he rolls, and the parachute falls out down there. We got a could do better letter back the next day. Thanks very much. Could we have the shot, please? Where the man actually bails out and the parachute opens. So we did it again the 3rd day. We had a parachute expert there who said, 5 seconds after this body leaves this airplane, it will open. It's on the clock. It didn't. We had to send it back, and we all got fired. They just ran back and said, if you can't get the shot, you may as well come home. You obviously don't know what you're doing. And that was the end of it. This desperate plastic dummy was falling to the ground. And at the last moment, a little bit of parachute just whisked up, but too late, it hit that deck. Surprise, surprise. Opening night, go to watch it. It's one of the most featured shots in the film. So we got fired for one of the most featured shots in the film. It's in the aerial sequence ballet. And you suddenly see the music, it doesn't. The music goes with it. We stay with it. It's probably the longest shot in the sequence, so we got the sack for it. But we'd done that by then. She remembers those times. She's written about those times. The times when friends would go off in the evening in bombers, and they'd have a cup of tea first in the pub, and she lived in the pub down the road from the airfield. And then 3 out of 10 of them would not come back. And you had to learn to live with that and move on. And the ones that did come back came for tea the next day and didn't talk about the ones that hadn't. It was a very dramatic time. And these young men lost their lives at an appallingly large rate. She lived.
A tribute to the few, the Battle of Britain, pilots and the people involved.
Don't just stand there, get one up! Thousands away! In the trenches!
Everything in the script was based on a character that we either met or knew about. Sailor Milan, South African, was very much the life of Bob Shaw, who had a wife and children. Dame Felicity Peake, who turned at the end of the war, became head of the WAFs. Everything she told me about her adventures as a young WAF were represented by Susanna York.
And I think it was a very important film to make too, for people who had fought.
I have absolutely no idea why they picked me. I mean, I thought, I suppose that the edge was that knowing nothing about the Battle of Britain, apart from what the man in the street knew, having spent my time in the Navy, it was all new and fresh, and I could have a neutral viewpoint both about the German side and the RAF, because you can get, when you get experts, they sometimes become so tied up with their knowledge that they have no sense of proportion about the whole picture. I just finished a picture, Funeral in Berlin, with Michael Caine for Harry Saltzman, and he came up to me one day and said, I've got a present for you. And I thought, oh, well, that's very nice, put it in the car. And he said, no, it's Battle of Britain. How'd you like to direct the Battle of Britain? Benny Fish was a Polish pilot in the Battle of Britain. He can tell you all about it. Go and see him. And I found Ben's enthusiasm for the project. He sold me. He gave me a lot of research material. And very quickly I said, yes, this is going to be an exciting project. It turned out to be a slightly questionable present, a poison present. Benny helped me to meet so many people who had partaken in the Battle of Britain, from the very top, Lord Dowding, down to armourers, all the personnel and the pilots themselves. And then gradually working up to the German side of it, where Adolf Galland, who was at the end of the war general in charge of the Luftwaffe. So I felt well protected with all this help. The aces started to get me worried, because they said, oh, well, you see, Guy, on Wednesday the 19th, I mean, we knew that the Germans had changed their tactics. I said, you're talking rubbish. You were just sitting there waiting to scramble. And I tried to ask Lord Dowding on 2 occasions, and he was very, very elderly and in a wheelchair, how it was that he didn't make up his mind about the big wing and what have you. And of course, I didn't know that he was ultra reading the German intercepts. He knew how many aeroplanes were going to fly the next day and what their targets were. So this is why he was able, to a large extent, to control his forces and deploy them to the best of the possible ability. But because of the Official Secrets Act, he couldn't tell me this. And this goes back to the pilots were saying, and of course we knew this, that, and the other thing. No, you didn't know that Dowding was reading German signals. You didn't know that either. That's the only area where the film is historically inaccurate. The first thing I obviously said to Harry Saltzman, where the hell are you going to get the airplanes from? Because we can't use any combat material from the Second World War, because that's all black and white, and we're making it in Technicolor. He said, well, that's all taken care of, and as you know, that was quite an effort to assemble all the planes.
There were only 6 Hurricanes in the entire world, one of which was completely rebuilt by a pilot in Canada, and he flew it all the way from Canada to England just to be in the movie. There were 1 Stuka, which you see arrive outside in Berlin. When you see the Stuka attack on Dover, those are models. Sadly, we didn't want to use models because all the flying sequences were for real. But the Stukas, they were non-existent. And you don't just start building airplanes. I mean, films cost enough as it is.
That was a big job because no Stuka existed. So the Stukas had to be radio control models and miniatures for the radar towers, but they were placed at Dover and Deal, and good work was done by the miniature department.
As far as the Hurricanes were concerned, I think there were only about 2 or 3. We had at Pinewood Studios, where the film was based, a huge construction building all these mock-up Spitfires, Hurricanes, Messerschmitts. So every time we did an attack on an airfield, we blew up the mock-ups, not the real planes. We only had about 11, 12 Spitfires that could actually take off at once. Those aircraft on a daily basis were being reserviced, rebuilt, because parts would fall to pieces, you know. And a lot of these aircraft were outside airfields on show at the entrance to the airfield. They had concrete in their tires. They hadn't been touched for 20 years. So we collected them and serviced them and put oil in them and hoped they would fly. So there was a huge risk of safety. And that's why we had to be very meticulous about every scene we did. Nothing was done from the hip, ever.
Ils sont à Sedan.
For the benefit of the uneducated among us, I shall translate.
Our chum can't believe the Sudan's fallen. I can.
We either stand down or blow up. Which do you want?
It isn't funny. Cut it out. They're close.
Höhen. Falke. Jawohl, Herr Reichsmarschall. Geben Sie mir eine Staffel Spitfire.
Casting was very easy. Harry had the idea of paying them all, every single actor, be it a star or small part, a daily rate, which would be the same for everybody, and it's for Battle of Britain and you bloody well do it. And to the man, they all said, yes, please.
You found that artists would slash their normal fee just to play these roles. Certainly people like Laurence Olivier and people like that were begging. It was just a lineup of men who wanted to play in those roles. It became a bit of a movie as well as a film, but it didn't suffer for that.
Everybody was in awe of Laurence Olivier. He was the greatest actor, and at the time I believe he was having the cancer treatment and goodness knows what. You would certainly not have known it. We filmed his stuff at Pinewood, and the real Lord Dowding, who he portrayed on screen, came down to play you, trying to portray what you did during the battle and making a very great mess of it. And Lord Dowding says, "Oh, I'm quite sure you are." And it just broke everybody up. Kenneth Moore, the archetypal English actor, he was in some scenes we did at Duxford with from the front of this hangar as it all happened, and had to jump down into a trench in front, and this thing just blew to hell. And I thought, I wonder whether they would be allowed to do this today, because I mean, it was really quite hairy, the whole thing. The scene is there. Robert Shaw had the most incredible presence on film, I thought. When he got the right part, when he hit it right, he was so powerful. And the way he led that squadron off, you'd really believe he would inspire people. He was a tiger of a man.
Never fly straight and level for more than 30 seconds in the combat area. How many times have I told you? Come on, I'll give you a lift.
I thoroughly enjoyed doing it. I really liked Guy Hamilton. I'd worked with Chris before. We sparred a bit, but we got on pretty well. Mr. Warwick, or something like that.
What parts of London can we use that haven't been rebuilt and got skyscrapers and what have you? St. Catherine's Dock is an area just the other side of Tower Bridge, and it was very, very heavily bombed by the Luftwaffe during the war and had never been rebuilt. And we just got in by the skin of our teeth before they started to knock them down. We said, look, we'll do it for you. And we were able to put fire bombs and set fire to all these great, big, old dockyard things, and it was fun and fine. And we said thank you.
When we did the scenes over London, the Heinkels coming over to bomb London, I mean, that was another scary moment, because here we are with these antique planes. It was a scary day, and it must have been really weird for the people looking up, seeing the Germans bombing London in 1968.
I was still at school. I was 10 years old, and of course was frustrated at being in the classroom when we could see in the newspapers, because I don't think we had television then, that filming was going on all over England. However, for me, one day on the way to school, I heard aircraft coming over.
Mr. Smith, I'm cool. Mr. Smith.
But this was a very distinctive sound, one I'd never heard before. And it turned out to be the B-25 Mitchell camera ship used by the film unit with 2 German Heinkel bombers. And they came over very low indeed, but of course we just couldn't wait to see it. And it was the talk of the class and everyone of that generation for several months.
I have to say, one of the great joys of working on the film was to meet a lot of most distinguished technical people. Freddie Young, for instance, who was one of the great cinema photographers. And he was just the most charming man and so helpful to me, and used to come up and tell me this, that and the other. And I remember he saw me trying to shoot the stuff in the harbour when all the barges were there, and he came up. And of course they only had about, I don't know, 20 barges, and there were meant to be thousands of them there. He came up and said, "Of course, old boy, you know, it is a matte shot, you know." And I said, "Yeah, okay, thanks, Freddie." I'd sort of realised that. But he was just so helpful, and I just watching the way he worked and the way he lit things. He did a wonderful takeoff.
A documentary approach and trying to get as near to the truth as we could. No problems on the British side. Why not apply the same principles on the German side? Adolf Gallant was enormously helpful, obviously, with putting me in touch with all the German aspect and the tactics that had to be engaged.
The German pilots gained their experience in Spain, in the Spanish Civil War. And you very quickly learned the German tactics. And we copied them, the fighters, because they knew what they were doing. We didn't. So we learned from them. And they were very good.
But I did have a falling out with Adolf because he was always slightly insistent that there was no such thing as Nazis in the Luftwaffe, which I thought was pushing it a bit. And Gallant says they would never give the Nazi salute. I said, "You know, you're joking. You weren't even there. I mean, let's start from that." I bet you that if Goering was yelling at something and they pulled away, I bet you they would have... and so whether he did or didn't became an issue, and I never saw Gallant from then on.
We just got on with making the movie and knew it was an important movie, and knew that Harry Saltzman had really put his head in the noose with a film that was a huge scale and a huge undertaking and a huge commitment on his part, because once he started, he couldn't stop. And there was a lot of careers at risk with this film.
And if you consider that this film was budgeted at like $17 million, it was huge, absolutely huge. And it was being financed by an American company who suddenly realized that they weren't even in the war when the Battle of Britain was fought, and that the American public would not know what the heck it was all about. So I should think that Harry was very pressured at the top for the money that he was being given by United Artists.
It's a lovely film. It's a wonderful film, and I know at the premiere a lot of the guys, there were a number of wet eyes at the end of the premiere, and a lot of the Fighter Association, who I've become very close with in recent years, the members, stood up and applauded at the end. As far as I'm concerned, if that's what they think of the film, then it served its purpose at the time.
Even my own family, I mean, I learnt that my mother's brother, Leslie, he was a pilot, he flew Spitfires, and he was in the Battle of Britain. He was 20. He trained for 9 months in Canada to fly Spitfires. He went out on a sortie one day and never came back. He got lost in the channel. You can't imagine 20-year-old boys flying these airplanes. It's unbelievable. And just shooting at each other. Just shooting at each other just seems like ridiculous.
And I still can't believe that young men of that age got in those things and fought a war. And then, having fought that war, which was all over in an hour, came back, had a cup of tea, and went up and did it again.
My name is Gerald Stapleton. My first name, given to me by my parents, was Basil, and I had so much trouble at school with Basil, so I elected to have Gerald, which is my second name. I first was interested in the Air Force in '36 when Alan Cobham's Air Circus came to our school and landed on the football field. They were all biplanes, and my brother had joined the Air Force, my elder brother, and we'd always been in competition, so I decided to join it. I joined it in January '39, and people who joined it at the same time, at the same age, I was 18 and a half when I joined, we were very lucky having a year's training, virtually a year's training on all Tiger Moths, Hearts, or Daxes. They're bigger biplanes. And then we went to an operational training unit where we went on to Harvards and Hurricanes. After that, you were posted to a squadron. I was initially posted to 32 Squadron at Biggin Hill, and then was posted to 603. And we had older chaps there who'd been flying in peacetime with the squadron. These were the people we felt sorry for because they had families, wife, children, and they were the first ones to go. They were good pilots, but they weren't good combat pilots because we'd never had any experience. Although we did shoot a couple of German aircraft down in Scotland, they were bombers. They weren't dealing with fighters. No, none of us were, until we learned how to deal with it. In that period of time, we had quite a few casualties. And 603 went down to Hornchurch in late August 1940. And that's when we became engaged with the Battle of Britain. We didn't have any idea of combat against a large fleet of bombers and fighters. We started flying in threes, and 3 aeroplanes cannot stay together. 2 can. So after very bad casualties in the first week, we started flying in finger fours. When we say finger fours, we mean that formation, exactly like that. 2 and 2. And our casualties then started to drop. Radar would identify foreign aircraft, but they couldn't identify what models they were. They didn't know whether they were bombers or fighters. So until they crossed the coast where the observer corps on the ground could say, those are bombers and those are fighters, and phone that information back to control, we were sitting on the ground waiting for us to be scrambled. And then all we had to do was climb for height. They already had height. They had their operational height. And that was a disadvantage we found ourselves in. The one advantage we did have was the Germans were flying over enemy territory. We lost over 500 pilots in the Battle of Britain, but we lost over 800 aircraft. The crash landed in Britain, but the pilots were okay. The German pilots weren't. They were taken prisoner of war. And that's one of the reasons why the Battle of Britain had the outcome it had. There was no dogfighting. It was in and out. And reform, the leader of your flying unit would say, right, we'll reform over Hornchurch or Biggin Hill at 20,000 feet. And then you'd get a few of the aircraft in the squadron to get over Biggin or Hornchurch, reform and go back and see if there's anything you could find. But there wasn't one German bomber formation that was stopped before it got to its target. They were all shot down going home. There's the time element again. That's when they were shot down. The longer it went on, the more you were untouchable. You know, you'd have friends killed and that sort of thing, but why you were lucky you didn't answer any questions. And I know some people who were guilty of surviving. Don't include me among that lot. I wasn't guilty of surviving. And it was pure luck that anybody in the Air Force survived. Skill, that amount, but that's all. And I was shot down once. That cannon shell could have come through my fuselage and hit the armor plate behind me, and it throws the armor plate forward. And it would have thrown me forward, and I wouldn't have been able to get out of the aeroplane. But it was lucky that it wasn't through the fuselage. It was lucky it was in the wing. I was taken prisoner of war. I was shot down in Germany. And no blood. I jumped out of a Spitfire at night, was shot down during the Battle of Britain, was shot down in Germany in typhoons. No wounds. If that's not lucky, I'd like to find out what is. We had a very narrow view of the whole thing. And when you're 20 years old and in a Spitfire, it was exhilarating. You're firing at an airplane. No question of firing at a body. You can't see the people. And I think pilots were relieved when they saw a parachute. Didn't matter which side it was. You know, that was a good thing that the chap got out. And you didn't have time for regrets. And if you thought it was going to happen to you, you wouldn't have been any good, would you? You can see that. If you were scared, and you always thought, it'll never happen to me. It didn't.
You can teach monkeys to fly better than that.
Going into London with 24 hours off, from 12 to 12, going to a nightclub where you had to belong to a wine club to get liquor, and then going on to a Turkish bath where you'd get there around about 11 o'clock. You'd have a Turkish bath, sweat in the steam room, your cold plunge. Upstairs, you'd have a cot to sleep in after a massage. And by God, you felt good the next day. Those are the things that I remember.
With regard to taking still photographs, which we need for promoting the movie, it is essential that with the flying sequences, the still cameras would be mounted almost parallel to the lens of the movie camera, so that the photographs that were taken, sometimes with automatic clicker, or sometimes if there was room with the stills man, the stills would actually match the scene we were shooting. There's no point in taking a photograph from a different angle. So that's how we did the shots up in the air. So now we're going to show you some stills that we have taken in these dogfights that will give you an idea of how this was done.